I'm so glad that you could join us this afternoon for our third symposium celebrating the work and life of Robert E. Cormier. This symposium marks the opening of our most recent exhibit in the three-part series of thematically arranged digital exhibits of curated documents from his collection held here at Fitchburg State. It's a pleasure to stand at this podium now after 6 years of work digitizing archival artifacts for our online exhibits. My colleagues, Anna Consalvo and Katie Covino, share my delight having you here to celebrate and share in today's discussions. First and foremost, we would not have been able to do any of this work if it were not for the blessing of the Cormier family and their willingness to entrust us with the shepherding of their father's legacy into a digital era. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Chris Cormier, Robert's daughter, to commence our afternoon's programming.
Thanks, Elise. On behalf of my siblings, Bobby, Pete, Renee, I want to thank Fitchburg State University, and especially Katie, Elise, Anna, and Asher, who I know have worked tirelessly at creating this third exhibit of our dad's work, entitled Twisted Intimacy. The site, as I'm sure you've all seen, is mesmerizing. Not only have his words been presented with thought and care, but the colors and the design are beautiful and honor Dad's work. Twisted Intimacy certainly describes Dad's writings. He loved to bring his reader to the brink of evil and discomfort and show the underbelly of society. After all, Dad was the one who used Yeats' last lines of his poem, The Circus Animal's Desertion, as the epigraph in his final novel, The Rag and Bone Shop, which read, "I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." It doesn't get much darker or twisted than that. And while that phrase represents his work, it's ironic that it doesn't describe our dad, the man. We knew him as a straightforward and loving father who wasn't afraid to speak honestly and from the heart. No twisted message there. And he loved Fitchburg State University, Fitchburg State College, as it was known when he was alive. He loved that he was able to come here as a student in the 40s. Sitting in English classes fueled his passion for writing. It was a very special time in his life. And he loved, too, that his papers could be kept here, that Bob Foley and Marilyn McCaffrey worked so diligently to begin his collection. His work is still in capable and caring hands here, and we all thank you. It's hard to believe that this year will mark the 20th anniversary of Dad's death. It's been a long time since we've had a conversation with him, read new work by him, enjoyed his warm company. I know I speak for my siblings and for our beloved mom, who has too passed on, when I say how appreciative we are that you, the caretakers of his works, keep his voice alive for us. Thank you.
So before I begin a tour of our actual digital exhibits, which unfortunately, as a behind-the-scenes kind of gal, we haven't really shared as publicly as we should have. But before I begin, I'd like to share a few words of thanks to the many people who have supported this project now and through the years. We are first and foremost indebted to Asher Jackson, the university's archivist, for his invaluable expertise and constant goodwill. None of this is possible without you. Thank you as well to all of those who have helped prepare the logistical and technological aspects of this symposium, especially Jen Mello, Joe Flanagan, Frank Campo, Nathan Robichaud, Joe Phelan, Dave Oster, Jared Roberts, Travis Falk, and Owen Edwards. Again, as a behind-the-scenes girl, it's good to recognize all the behind-the-scenes folk. Oh, yeah. Our long-distance partners include event manager Kyle Fayen and instructional technologists Brian McKenzie and Scott Dillingham at UT Tyler, who have arranged remote access to the symposium. So we have several other classes who are watching this live, and from UT Tyler as well. Also crucial to our collaborations with UT Tyler are the work and support of Rebecca McKay, director of the Robert Munz Library, and colleagues and doctors Wesley Hickey, Dean of the College of Education and Psychology, and Seth Wilson. Here at FSU, our thanks go out to Kathy Canny, Matt Bruin, and Emily Austin Bruns of the 125th Anniversary Committee, Renee Fradantonio, Trish Lavanine, Kristen Lorty, and Jacqueline Kremer from the Amelia V. Gallucci Cyril Library, and the Department of English Studies for supporting the symposium. While digitizing archival material and writing metadata is not the most glamorous scholarship, it is a crucial practice necessary in the time of transition from a print-centric to a digital-centric information and text production environment. Today is both a challenging time for preservation efforts, given the quickened pace of media obsolescence, and a promising time for digital humanists at the ground level of creating information systems and projects that could influence how humans and their digital technologies interact to create and document culture. Think for a moment of how much gets left behind when we quote unquote upgrade to the newest technologies. What cassette decks never made it to digital files? What family footage do you have trapped on a VHS that you cannot watch? The archivist is nodding in the back. Even more, as a literary scholar and book historian, Jerome McGann noted in his early years of working at the William Blake Archive Project, what we preserve is more than just the words, because otherwise a plain text file would do. Do I document the font, the paper type, the unnamed recipient of a note, or the scribbled margin notes of travel details on a book manuscript? What is worth packing up and bringing to our digital future? For Ana Consalvo, Katie Covino, Asher Jackson, and I, the Robert E. Cormier collection must make that move. Since 2014, we've been working on 3 digital archive exhibits that I would like to show you today. Each exhibit is structured around a theme and 3 novels from the author's oeuvre. The first exhibit is on censorship, the second on bullying and terrorism, and the third on sexualization of children. Throughout all of the exhibits, we make prominent Cormier's writing process. So, as a little tour of the exhibit, this is what it looks like. We've started by collecting artifacts into like little collections. We imagine them like little museum rooms, and collected kind of similar artifacts together onto a page. So these are all digitized files of artifacts that are here at our collection. And we've since summarized them and written all the metadata so that they're all shareable and searchable. Yet to transcribe them, that's painstaking work. Every single artifact is too linked, so you can search by items created by the same person, items that are directly related to this text. We can look for similar artifacts. Or we've also developed an entire tagging system of kind of common topics and themes across the collection. So if you're curious about his conversations about nuns, these are all of the artifacts that we have currently digitized that specifically mention and talk about or include nuns in his stories. Kind of the lovely happenstance of looking at his artifacts was that we would find kind of relevant links across all kinds of different genres that he writes in. So we would see kind of magazine stories that he's written about his time in Catholic schools as a child. We'll see the same in his kind of newspaper articles. We'll see the same in his work with his own parish. So they're also kind of arranged by type. So if you wanted to look at just all of the newspaper articles that we've digitized that are about him too. They're all sorted in that way as well. So we try to make it as searchable and accessible as possible. So you can search by all of the tags that we have as well, in case you're more curious about serial killers than nuns. The artifacts are also searchable, so you can type in any word that you're looking for. We haven't, as I've mentioned, currently transcribed every single document. It's quite a time-consuming process, but we were very careful in writing all of our metadata to be mindful of key terms that we think that would be highly searchable. So we've also collected artifacts by novels. So if teachers were using individual novels, they can kind of skip to just looking at artifacts that are specifically about a novel that's included or highlighted in our collections. Now, we chose 3 novels for each exhibit, but there were many, many others that we could have easily included as well. At every opportunity that we had, we tried to link material so that people could kind of navigate and find their own kind of interest points and stories. They could follow individual authors. So in this case, we'd link them to writers of our individual artifacts. We did have some letters that were written frequently by the same author. So you can kind of follow a string of letters as well, which is quite nice. You can search the entire collection all at once as well and sort them in a range of ways. So we wanted to make the artifacts that we had as accessible as possible in as many ways that we could possibly imagine being useful. We've also linked the previous exhibits, so you can jump to our collection from 2016, which was on bullying and terrorism. And it has kind of a similar format, so they're all equally kind of legible, 3 different novels. And then our original on censorship. So it was quite a labor of love putting all of these together and continually working on improving them and improving navigation. And there's always room to continually add to them as well. So it is never-ending work to work on an archive. Smirks again from the archivist. So we've also been working on prototypes of other projects that we might continue on in the future. The chief one, we can also share these on social media too. So we try to put in as many plugins as possible. There are dozens and dozens that we can use, and we keep updating them as time goes on. So all of these are shareable as well, so that we can keep them kind of off the archives and people can talk about them in the venues that they prefer. But when we're looking at some of our future work, Anna and Katie and Asher and I all have big dreams of what we can continue to work on, not just in the exhibits, but in all kinds of other related projects regarding Cormier's work. So we've also kind of started building prototypes of an annotated edition of The Chocolate War. And it's been a really fun kind of playing around with these early ideas. So we made a digital edition of 2 chapters from The Chocolate War, and we also kind of worked on a print version. So in this case, we're prototyping a few different ideas. For chapter 17, we had these kind of rollovers of commentary that we are having as readers about the book. We really wanted to highlight the kind of process of active reading and of dialogue as we're working with kind of digesting a piece of literature. and then including artifacts from the archive that are related specifically to components of that chapter. So again, we try to make as much searchable and usable as possible. In this case, since it was a much smaller kind of prototype, we did transcribe all of the documents. So all of the archival documents are fully searchable. And if we continue on with this project and it scales up to be larger, we can run text analysis and all kinds of other kind of digital analytics on the content of all of his work, which would be such an interesting process to do since it's underrepresented for young adult authors in particular and contemporary authors as well. So we did kind of link related texts as well to documents as often as we could so people could follow a kind of a string or a conversation of materials. So in chapter 18, we also tried kind of another prototype where instead of having the archival documents at the end, we got rid of our kind of readerly comments and put in specific artifacts that were related to kind of individual segments of chapters. We tried to include as many different media artifacts as we could, from letters from fans, letters that Cormier has written, any video or audio interviews that we had as often as we could, so that people had lots of different ends to thinking about his work and his writing. One of the things that we admired all as English professors was that that writing is a deep process, that it's a conversation with yourself, that it's a conversation with your readers, and being able to kind of showcase that for young readers, that an author isn't born in a day and a book isn't a first draft, that it's a very long process. So this was kind of a mock-up of our print version, and we tried to include kind of artifacts. If you could rewind that for a bit, Nathan, just so we can see that book part. Sorry, I went really fast on it. So like on the top of chapter 17, you can see there's little keywords. Those are all kind of searchable tags that are in the digital exhibit, so students could search those things and look for other artifacts that related to that. We included kind of bubble thoughts of our own as related to individual paragraphs, and embedded archival information that was kind of relevant to that moment in the book. And this is something that Asher and Anna and Katie and I kind of worked on about a year and a half ago, and we've put it to the side, but we love doing this project, and it's something that we hope that we're able to continue, along with many other works in support of using archives in the classroom, of engaging with literature in a deep way, of taking primary texts and not thinking about them as just things for university professors, for scholars of that sort, but for anyone who's truly interested in writing and in Cormier's work, and in really taking a deep dive into primary texts. It's not just for scholars, it's for anyone who's truly interested. Okay, so I'm happy to have shared the work that we've done so far and the work that we hope to continue doing. I'm happy to answer any questions about the archive as it sits, as the one who's spent quite a bit of time putting it together. So if you had any questions about the archive or our book thoughts, I'm happy to address them. Coming around with a mic.
Lise, thank you. This is so exciting. So thank you very much. I guess one thing I wondered about was when you first started the symposium, many years ago, did you have mapped out these 3 themes, or how did the themes come about?
Well, they came about while Anna was still an English professor here. We actually had kind of drafted a letter of intent for the entire suite of these 3 exhibits. And, we looked through a lot of his work. We'd read almost all of his novels by that point. And we had kind of picked out which novels we wanted to focus on, which ones we thought would have kind of really broad interest amongst a lot of his scholars. So we started with those and then looked at those books and thought, well, what could we highlight that kind of unifies these in an interesting way? What's content here or a topic here that even if someone doesn't know Cormier, they would be interested in the idea and then come to Cormier through those concepts. So we did actually kind of chart out first by the books we wanted to highlight and then by a kind of unifying theme. And those were all put together 6 years ago? It was some time ago. So we've persistently kept on with the work, and we hope to continue pressing on with round 2 that we've not yet conceptualized, but we're always thinking about. I think we had a question in the back, too.
I was just curious about whether you're tracking who's coming to the archive and are able to engage in conversations with folks who are utilizing these resources, which, by the way, which are great. So thank you very much for all the work. It's wonderful.
Yes, it's something that we hope to actually do quite a bit more because the process of putting them together was so labor intensive, and the 3 of us have a limited amount of time. So we focused all of our energy really in building really good exhibits. We've started using them in individual classes. Katie's used them quite a bit in her classes. And I know that Anna has talked about kind of pedagogies around using these in classrooms. We haven't been kind of keeping analytics on the use of the digital archives quite yet, but data collection is to come. So we have actually been sharing them more, and we get more and more interest in them as time goes on. And now that we've kind of completed the let's put it together really, really well phase, we're hoping to actually deploy them much more frequently and be able to prepare materials that would help teachers use the material in their classes. So, thank you.
Is this purely an in-college process, or can it be brought forth to other high schools and colleges that would be willing to take part in it, and maybe even fund some of it?
I don't think that we would snub anyone who'd want to work with us.
No, I mean to advance it. I didn't mean.
Yes. I think that there are lots of opportunities to use these materials, and being able to use them in classrooms outside of Fitchburg State would be a lovely development. So, as I had mentioned, we hadn't spent a lot of time kind of proselytizing the work to other teachers, but it's something that is part of, like, that was the original onus of the work, is we were making these available so people can use them. And if people are galvanized enough to want to contribute their time and their energy to doing this work, we'd be happy to have more in the ranks. It is quite time-consuming work, so it's helpful to have more hands. At least if we're thinking about kind of locally, I'm developing a course too where students are going to be starting to work on digital archives, writing metadata for that, and learning a little bit more about preparing digital editions. So we're doing that more and more in our classes here, and however much we might be able to get that into middle and high school classes, I'll leave that to the conversations. We have a later panel on kind of pedagogies and the use of the archives there, and I'm sure many of the panelists will speak to those ideas in particular. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We'll have just a minute or two between our next panel, a brief recess.
So I think it's a fitting transition to now move into the first of our student panels, speaking about students using the archives. So this panel is entitled Negotiating Gendered Themes in Robert Cormier's John Fitch Newspaper Columns. And during this 25-minute panel discussion, our 4 student panelists, Gregor Goodlett, Lucinda Orn, Kat Pellerin, and Matt Sandowski, will share their experiences in the archive and walk through portions of their papers, which they wrote as either honors English students or writing 1 students with me in class. A question and answer period will follow, so please hold your questions until that time. Those joining virtually may send questions through the chat feature at any time, and those questions will be included in the Q&A at the end. Virtual participants, please take a moment to mute your microphones, while those physically present will do the same with their portable devices. So let's give our attention to these students as they describe John Fitch and explore the connection comparison to Robert Cormier, as they explore the archives and share a little bit about how they use them, as they delve into particular articles that I selected during one of our summer sessions in the archives. Just to give a little background, when we were putting together this 3rd digital exhibit, I came across the John Fitch articles and sort of fell in love, did a real deep dive, sort of binged the whole season, as it were. So these particular articles were ones that I engaged with as a fan of Cormier, but also as a gender scholar, because they're complicated and they're tough, and they invite dynamic tension and discourse. So we'll hear a little bit about that. And lastly, each of the student panelists will talk about how the articles themselves that I pre-selected related to their thesis statements and their papers. So thank you all very much.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I first want to thank Dr. Covino for allowing us the opportunity to use these articles, and I would also like to thank Cormier's children and everyone else for being here to listen to what we have to say. So for those of you who don't know, Robert Cormier was born in 1925 and passed in 2000. He was born in Leominster, attended Leominster High School, attended Fitchburg State College, and he was a true American author. Since we are all here to celebrate his work, I thought I would give a little background to the awards that have been presented to him in his lifetime. Firstly, he received the Carnegie Medal nomination in 1983, the Reader's Choice Award also in 1983, the Massachusetts Author of the Year Award in 1985, the Margaret A. Edwards Award in 1981, which presents authors with recognition for creating works that aid young readers and helping them to identify their role for themselves and in society. And the last award is the Phoenix Award, which was presented to him in 1997 for Best Children's Literature that did not win during the time that it was written. So that was written 20 years earlier in 1977, and it wasn't given the recognition that it deserved, so it got the Phoenix Award 20 years later. So I aim not only to speak of Robert Cormier, but also of his relationship with John Fitch IV. I mean, relationship in an interpersonal sense, of course, because they were one and the same person. John Fitch is his alias for some of the newspaper articles that he wrote, which are found in the archives. As part of Twisted Intimacy, he gave discourse on gender and language, chivalry and feminism, and fathers and daughters and their relationships. He put forth notions and values that often counteracted, which presented ambivalent opinions, I guess you could say, about the topics of which he discussed. Some of his most popular works were I Am the Cheese, After the First Death, We All Fall Down, and The Chocolate War. Those are some of his famous books. And Fitch, specifically, supports empowerment of women and equal rights while also explicitly self-identifies as a chauvinist, as he has noted in our articles that we used. These contradictions make for what I personally consider to be an engaging and thought-provoking form of literature, which are often considered controversial, which is why I think is part of the reason that Dr. Covino fell so in love with these. And that's a basic overview of Robert Cormier and John Fitch.
So, we were given 4 Robert Cormier articles to construct a synthesis argumentative essay. The articles we used were Letter from Gloria, The Good Word, Sexes and the Guidelines, and Beauty That Lingers. I know for other classes or courses, students went into greater depth exploring the Cormier Archives and all that they had to offer. The archives are large and include 2 record groups, one dedicated to Robert Cormier's works, whether published in newspapers or as short stories, novels, or unfinished novels. The second record group included documents and artifacts that were about Robert Cormier, including reviews, criticism, biographies, audio recordings, and photographs. The archives themselves were simple in design, which made it easy to use and navigate. What was interesting to me was the fact that Cormier was able to say some of the things he did in this alternate personality he made for himself. John Fitch IV was the voice he used to make his riskier comments. For instance, in The Sexes and the Guidelines, his comments on a woman's appearance being more important over his profession were sexist. For example, in one scenario Cormier draws for us, a man named Harrison, who compliments a wife for her looks and the husband for his profession. He states, and I'm paraphrasing here, "What is really wrong with this? He wasn't impressed by Anne's accomplishments. He felt that she was an attractive brunette." This would have been looked down upon by feminists at the time. I choose feminists specifically because Cormier himself claims to be one himself. This to me is a clear example of Cormier expressing his riskier thoughts through the alternate persona, John Fitch.
Similarly, I think one of the things that I found the most interesting with Fitch was how he didn't believe that not wanting to change the way we talk about women made him a male chauvinist. In one of the articles in So On, The Sexes and the Guidelines, he complains about the changes that the McGraw-Hill Publishing Company made regarding how to write about men and women, and said, "If that makes me a male chauvinist, then so be it." The way we talk and write about men and women can have a huge impact on how we think about and perceive them. Men were often written about by explaining their accomplishments, while women were often objectified and only commented on by their attractiveness. McGraw-Hill Publishing Company wanted to change it so that, for example, like Gregor said, if you comment on the husband's career, you should also comment on the wife's career, rather than saying that, for example, Henry is a shrewd lawyer and his wife Anne is a striking brunette. Fitch admits that he doesn't understand why saying that is such a negative thing, claiming that if that's what the author intended for his audience to know, then they should be able to do so. Also in the article, and So On, The Good Word, Fitch claims that as an admitted chauvinist, he cherishes the femininity of the opposite sex and still will carry on his campaign against pantsuits and insist on opening doors for girls and women. Today, Fitch would have been very upset at the fact that I'm not presenting in a dress and instead wearing dress pants. It's amazing how times have changed, and I'm grateful for the progress that society has made regarding the way in which we think and speak about women.
Hello, everybody. I just also want to say, as mentioned before, thank you for the opportunity to present at this panel, and thank you for the opportunity to use these archives that have been very interesting, as well as just a tremendous addition to not only my general knowledge, but education about topics that are outside of my specific field of study. So thank you very much. I'm just going to talk briefly about sort of what's interesting about these articles, which I think everyone can say that everything. If you pick a random sentence in these articles, no matter what it is, what it says, it definitely says something about not only Robert Cormier, but about John Fitch. And as we know, these two individuals are one and the same, but also completely and utterly different, which is sort of amazing to see how someone who gets praised for writing wonderful children's books, as rightfully so, can also express such deep thoughts and emotions in these newspaper articles. And I know it's talked briefly upon sort of the feminist side of his papers, as well as being a male chauvinist. But I just wanted to speculate a little bit upon how paradoxical this seems. And although it may seem paradoxical, it's interesting to think that if we look at this instead of as one individual, but more so two individuals, we can see sort of that as maybe an excuse for it being okay for him to say some of these things in his newspaper articles compared to the general life that he just lived every day. And that may be just because the type of man that he was, not wanting to conform to one extreme or the other, and being that loving father, as we've seen before, and caring individual, which by these articles he rightfully was so.
So now, if you'll join us in taking a look at our essays and getting a glimpse at how we internalize the language found in John Fitch's articles and how we use them in our essays. So my essay was, if I had to give a general topic, it would be about political correctness. And while I did not individually use this article, which I am presenting to be Letter from Gloria, published in 1976, while I didn't use it personally in my essay, I do have examples for how it could have been used and how it relates to my topic. So the context of the article is Robert Cormier, or in this case, John Fitch, receives a advertising pitch for a magazine called Miss. The advertising pitch was from Gloria Steinem, and it wasn't directed to him personally. She essentially just wanted to advertise a pitch, probably sent it to many people, and he received it and realized that the magazine was for women who had been previously put down or put aside by men in their lives, and the advertisement was for him to join the magazine, which was a bit ironic for the discourse of his time. And so I went in the archive, revisited this. Wrote this 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now. I wanted to see in context of what this article is within the archives. So I searched the description, and it cited this article as a strange counterbalance of ideas, which I fully agree with. In one paragraph, he wrote, the only point I wish to make is that one can wish women to be dressed in skirt or dress and exude femininity and still be an ardent supporter of their rights in all facets of life. Again, a prime example of a strange counterbalance of ideas. So even though it wasn't explicitly used in my paper, I wanted to derive my paper from the notion that you can retain the ability to speak freely and conceptualize political correctness in this big gray area. So if you'll notice, I had annotated these when I was a freshman. I'm now a junior. And one of the things that I noted at the bottom here is the crease of freedom of expression versus political correctness will never unfold to reveal one solid line. And I think that very highly relates to John Fitch's ideas that you can challenge the notions of your time without being, or without breaking the boundaries to the point where that it's controversial but not detrimental to the opinions of the public. And that is how I related it to my essay.
My argumentative essay's thesis was Robert Cormier was not a feminist, and this is demonstrated by his contradictory statements. In the article, The Sexes and the Guidelines, he protests the self-censorship of gender-linked language because he believes the censorship threatens creativity. As I said in my essay, Cormier's use of language in his fiction is a clear example of the male gaze. The male gaze views women as nothing more than what a man sees. As Cormier puts it, sweet young thing, Cormier, 1974, page 2, implies a sexist outlook on women. Girls or women being described as things is not progressive and does not support the ideals of feminism. Without the archives, I would not have been able to do the extensive research required for the specific evidence used in my final essay.
So me and Gregor had very similar theses. So I also used The Sexes and the Guidelines. That was one of my more favorited article. So it was written in October of 1974. So the article, and so on, The Sexes and the Guidelines. In this, Fitch described why he was against the McGraw-Hill Publishing Company creating guidelines on how to write about men and women equally. He didn't agree with how they wanted to replace man with person, for example, in words such as chairman or congressman. Also, he disliked how the publishers wanted writers to use young women rather than sweet little thing. Fitch believed that these guidelines would, quote, replace sexism with something worse, a deadening of language. To Fitch, the freedom and creativity of writing was more important than the way in which we talk and refer to women. Despite its boundless opportunities, language has established a bridge that carries the possibility of expressing unbalanced views of men and women. McGraw-Hill Publishing Company established these guidelines for its authors and editors because of its belief that language has played a major role in the inequality of the sexes. This is because men and women can be detailed in any way a person wishes. Men were more often portrayed as strong and successful, whereas women were mostly described based on their looks and incapabilities. Fitch truly had a passion for the way words could reveal meaning and was upset that that language was changing to satisfy the equal treatment of men and women. He believed that it was acceptable to say or write anything for the sake of creativity. So I believe that through these articles, it really gave a great insight into the times and how men and women were treated differently, and how language is very important in helping to break those stereotypes.
So in my essay, I used the 4 articles that have been discussed a little bit, but specifically I looked closely, or most closely at Not Exactly Speaking Personally, which was one of the newspaper articles. And looking at this article sort of in cohesion with the other works that I know that was written by Robert Cormier is very interesting to see because of sort of the unconventional nature of this piece, especially how society views literature today. So it's very interesting to see sort of this piece collectively going against, or not necessarily against, but not for something that is seen in this day and age. And that is also very interesting because, as noted before, we know that although John Fitch and Robert Cormier were the same person, they weren't. Which is very interesting to also kind of conceptualize your mind around and see that someone that had written something that included that he argues for the equal rights of women, of course, but then follows it up in the next line with, and let those who wish to escape the kitchen escape. So I think that line sort of really sums up this article kind of holistically in how we can see what conditions were present at these times, not only in writing, but just in everyday activities. And point it in the direction that, yes, Robert Cormier was for equal rights, but we can also see that John Fitch was sort of twisting his arm there and saying, oh, well, these are how the times have been, these are how the times are, and who says they need to change. So I found that very interesting. And just to follow up with that, a little piece that I wrote in my paper, I think sums that up pretty well. I said, as some may interrupt such text with sincerity, sarcasm, and ridicule of the stereotypical housewife can be distinguished with the implication that some will not escape working in the kitchen because they either do not want to or cannot. So I thought that holistically these archives were something that drove me to write a paper out of interest and desire, and I think that it's something that a lot of people could benefit from.
Thank you. It was very interesting getting to hear again so many of the good points that I enjoyed when I had the privilege of reading your papers, either last fall or many years ago. I think that we'll open it up to questions or comments, whether from the audience here or from our audience, our virtual viewers, if there are any questions for the students or for me.
I always have questions. I actually have many questions, but I'll just start with one. In the beginning, you guys spent some time talking about the differences between him as a person and Fitch as a persona. So I was curious if, in reflecting on that in a published author, if you had thought about your own kind of uses of persona as you communicate with people that you know or even people that you don't know online. Like, do you kind of employ that kind of use of persona as well, and did that make you think about how you use that in your own communication?
I can address that first. I understand that you asked questions specifically related to online, but I would like to provide an example for when I was in Dr. Covino's class. She taught us explicitly about not only creating a persona, but utilizing our voice within our pieces. So when we would write an essay, not just this, but others too, to really make our voice known, that would help us to strengthen our points and the tone in which we are trying to convey our ideas. So not so much a persona as using our own voice to sort of strengthen us. When she taught me that, it's helped my writing ever since. So.
While the panelists are thinking about it, I really liked Matt's image of, I think it was John Fitch twisting Cormier's arm. That's such a cool way of thinking about these two sort of alter egos. And when I was trying to explain this to someone in promoting the symposium, I was said, oh, well, it's like Ask Abby or you know, it's like something like that. And they said, oh, so it's like Miley Cyrus and Hannah Montana. I was like, oh, of course. A little bit more of a contemporary example.
I've got another example of that. I was reading, in lieu of this symposium, I was reading a biography about Robert Cormier, and he said that John Fitch sort of reminded him of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mm-hmm. He made that example as well.
Any other comments about dual identities, or you talked a little bit about voice and authenticity lending strength to an academic paper. I think that's a great example. Any other examples, thoughts?
So continuing with the comment that I said about sort of twisting the arm, I think that this, specifically these newspaper articles, were of excellent insight to see just how different someone can be from expressing themselves or like physically with you or expressing themselves on paper or in what context that may be. In sort of thinking about it now, and I realized that writing this paper and sort of going through these archives was a great opportunity to sort of revisit persona in my own life, regardless of whether or not I realized it then. But sort of thinking upon it now, it is very interesting to see how one newspaper article that we look at, sort of whether it's in depth or it's quickly glancing over it, looking online to try and find the right source, it's sort of mesmerizing to see how different the same person can be.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments from the? We have a question.
I just want to say, I think it was fascinating to hear your discussion. As one of Bob Cormier's children, I've read a lot of the columns, but these are not ones that I'm super familiar with. We read the ones about family and things. And it struck me just hearing about his perspective back in the early 70s or late 60s compared to even how we grew up, but also you guys in 2020. I don't know that he ever thought that people so much in the future would be reading his words from so long ago. I just think it's really fascinating. I really appreciate you, even some of the things that I was like, oh, it's hard to hear he wasn't a feminist. But on the other hand, I really appreciate all of your perspectives. It was really, really fascinating. It gives me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Can I say one thing along those lines? He would love to be here hearing this and talking about it, wouldn't he? He'd be totally engaged with it, and he'd probably have a whole lot to say too, and have fun with it. And he'd really think you guys did a great job looking carefully at his work. He might have even thought maybe he should have thought about one or two things, maybe differently. I'm not sure, but it would have been fun. Right? Thank you.
Thank you. I think one thing that I'd like to share too is when we were reading those in the archive, when Katie and I found them, she really did binge them. Like, she no longer did anything else that day. She was like, no, I'm just going to read these all day. And Anna and I were looking around going, oh, okay. Have fun over there. So one of the things that was interesting was that each one, like, you can get a really visceral kind of emotional response, like, oh, that feels so wrong. And then you'll read a next one, and it's almost like very different. Like, this one wasn't in the John Fitch columns, but he had another, was in his Main Street collection of that column, and there was one that he wrote, and he kind of made this emphatic argument about how wonderful his life was as a house husband. And he kind of like ends it basically saying, well, who's to think negatively about house husbands? And I thought that was really interesting. Like, side by side, you could read one where he's basically saying, if that makes me a chauvinist, so be it, I'm a chauvinist. And then you read like the very next one from another column, and he says, why is anybody bothered about the fact that I'm a house husband? I like doing this, So it was really interesting to be able to see that so quickly and have to question your own kind of visceral responses right away, because there wasn't like one clear answer. Like, you can't pinpoint a person in one clear answer, which was really cool. So, any other questions?
All right, well then I will graciously thank our student panelists, and as you leave the panel, please take a copy of the book by our keynote. That is yours courtesy of a grant through the library. So thank you for presenting very much. Thank you. So now we are moving from our brief intermission into our next panel and our first faculty panel. This panel is entitled Twisted Intimacy, Content Area Experts Uncover Cormier's Darker Themes. In this 25-minute panel discussion, we'll hear from Deborah Stone, Associate Professor of Nursing and the Chair of Graduate Forensic Nursing Program, who researches victims and perpetrators of sexual violence. Corey Ryan, an Assistant Professor of Human Services, whose research focuses on public safety, psychology, diversity, and the intersection between the criminal justice system and mental health. And Lynn Kellner, licensed psychologist and professor of behavioral sciences who works with children who have experienced maltreatment and trauma and their families. Her research has included co-developing a gender-sensitive treatment model for male victims of sexual abuse. As with other panels, a Q&A period will follow. Please hold your questions through or until that time. Those joining us virtually, as with the past panel, can send questions through the chat feature, which will be posed during the Q&A session. Virtual participants, please take a moment to mute your microphones, while those who are physically present can silence their cell phones or devices. So, while we hope that the panel will be free-ranging, there are a few questions that the panelists have prepared, and we'll begin with those. Lynn, your focus on traumatic bonding and why people continue to get into unhealthy relationships connects to many of the texts and themes of this collection. Maybe you could help us understand this issue through two questions. The first question is, have you seen this dynamic of traumatic bonding play out in your work with children and families, and can you tell us a little about that?
Okay, sure. But first, I'd like to just clarify what I mean by traumatic bonding. Okay, and I want to go back and talk about a few. First of all, I want to mention something called the Stockholm Syndrome. Okay, and this was a term that we used to describe an incident that happened in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973, where 4 hostages were taken during a bank robbery, a failed bank robbery. And when they were finally released by the police 6 days later, the hostages defended the people who were the bank robbers. They said they were good people. They did not want to testify against them. In fact, they began raising money for their defense. And most of us would say, this is crazy, right? So this brings up the issue, why would they do that? And it comes to survival. If you're being held by someone against your will, if someone has the capacity to really hurt you, and in this case, these bank robbers had guns, they had complete control of these people, wouldn't you rather believe the people holding you were good intentioned? It will bring down your anxiety if you think, well, they're really a good person. They're not going to hurt me. And then I want to bring this into more intimate relationships, because that was strangers. And this brings in the concept of traumatic bonding, such as between children and abusive parents. And for the child to be abused by a parent, first of all, because they're egocentric, they usually think they did something wrong. And secondly, they're going to be able to survive and feel less anxious if they believe the parent really is good. And I just have to kind of change. And so what happens with traumatic bonding over time is people basically refuse to believe the other person really is disrespectful of them, to put it mildly. To believe it's their fault. If I just do this right, it will be okay. And I think that's why people continue in these relationships, to keep trying to make it right so the other will treat them with respect. And I could go on and on about this, but I know we have other questions as well.
Wonderful, thank you for that look. And I'm thinking about the texts that are at the center of the symposium. Specifically, I'm thinking right now of Heroes, and the really complicated relationship between the protagonist and someone who he views as a really heroic figure who later turns out to be very abusive. So thanks for really shedding light on that there. The second question that I'd like to pose to you, if I can, is how can we help people who may have normalized dysfunctional ideas about relationships from earlier experiences that may have involved traumatic bonding? And I'm sure your answer will shed light on your research and expertise, but I know that many of us are hearing it through the lens of the texts at the center of the symposium.
Okay. Well, I'll certainly put a plug in for therapy for people when they find themselves in relationships that are not healthy. The earlier we help people with this in their lives, the better off we are. With children who may have ideas, who may have internalized the messages but may not be able to articulate those messages, if we can work with them and often on a pre-verbal level in a way with young kids with play to kind of give them a different internalized sense of themselves and of what good relationships are. We do this in our residential programs with kids, and we have to give them a lot of corrective experiences because a lot of the kids we see who are in treatment and who come into the system and have experienced trauma have internalized images of relationships that are not healthy. And whereas a kid who grows up in a healthy household can tolerate when a parent has a bad day and shrug it off and say, well, tomorrow will be better, kids who grow up with that constant level of trauma and disrespect need constant corrective experiences, which is a lot of what we do in residential treatment facilities for kids and adolescents. It gets harder as people get older, but at the same time, people become more insightful, and that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Moving on now to a question prepared for Deb, and please do feel free to jump in at any time. I'm really encouraged when I see people nodding along because there's a lot of intersection in what's being discussed up here, so please feel free to jump in at any time. Deb, your insights into stalking are also pertinent to the texts and themes we're discussing today. I'm thinking particularly of the unpublished novel Toy Breakers. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that. In preparing for the symposium and in reviewing that text, we can say that it got dark quickly. So I think this will be very helpful for us understanding that. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the profile of stalkers.
Sure. So in general, stalking is repeated pattern of unwanted attention, whether it's harassment, any type of contact that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it's pretty broad. Today we have a lot of problems with the use of technology and social media to help with stalking, so it's become even worse than it used to be. There's spamming, there's video voyeurism. GPS systems can be put on your car, on your phone to track you without your knowledge. So, I mean, this stuff can be really scary. There's spyware they can put on your computer. But when you talk about the typologies, I found 7 in the literature. And so some of the reasons are there's domestic partners, which we touched on a little bit. There's the lust stalker. So somebody who just thinks that they want you and maybe they don't even know you. There's the love-scorned stalker, who's also called erotomania. So maybe this is a neighbor or an acquaintance that had a romantic interest that you didn't return, and it can get dark and kind of ugly. You've heard of celebrities being stalked. That's another typology. There's political stalkers. There's the hit stalker, which is murder for hire, and then there's the revenge stalker. So what's interesting also about that is, as with most types of interpersonal violence, more women than men are victims. But that doesn't mean men aren't victims, and it doesn't mean women aren't perpetrators. And I have to tell you, in my own research, that's what I found to be kind of really interesting. I did my master's thesis on the female sex offender. A lot of people say women don't do that. Women are nurturing. Women can use that nurturing front to fool you. I don't mean to cause fear, but women are no less deviant, just differently deviant. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, that's as I say, we are exploring the darker themes of Cormier and the symposium. Corey, your focus on offenders and perpetrators also connects to the themes of the symposium. So I have 2 questions for you. And after those 2 questions, I'll have reached the end of the prepared questions. I've been collecting some themes that I think speak across, but I'd love to hear you guys make connections yourselves. I certainly don't want it all to be from me. So Corey, first question to you. Could you share with us some of the common myths versus facts about sexual offenders?
Sure. Am I on?
So I think most folks, when they think about sexual offenders, think about the creepy old guy that lives in a van that has no windows, and they're giving away puppies and candy. And there's certainly a lot of public information that's out there that would suggest that that's what a sex offender is like, that they're creeping in the bushes, waiting for you to walk quietly down a sidewalk or an alleyway. You watch those movies and you're like, no, don't go down the alley. But the most frightening thing I think about sex offenders is that there is no one sex offender. You can't look at someone and say, you're a sex offender. If we could, my job would be much easier. But what's also, I think, really frightening and ties into Cormier's work is that the vast majority of sexual offenders are actually within a family. And they're even within the family, it's not necessarily who you would think it would be. Some of the numbers range to about 40-50% of sexual offenses within a family are actually perpetrated by juveniles within the family, so people under the age of 18. And the numbers are at about 18% of the sexual offenses within a family are perpetrated by children under 13. So the scariest place you can be is in your family, which is, I think ties in with what Cormier writes about a bit. So there's no one typology of sex offender. They're very heterogeneous in terms of race. They do tend to be males, but there are, again, female sex offenders. Again, some of the more recent literature puts about 85% of known sexual offenders as male. They're all socioeconomic statuses. I think I said race already, gender. So there's no one profile, but they do find some differences between those who perpetrate within a family versus those who perpetrate outside of a family. And folks who tend to perpetrate within the family, they tend to be younger, and their victims tend to be on the younger side. Sex offenders have the lowest recidivism rates of most crimes. So if someone's perpetrating within a family, they tend to not recidivate a lot, which recidivate means to offend again. Their crimes, their physical crimes against the children tend to be less physically invasive, but more impactful in an emotional way than an extra-familial or an outside-the-family sex offender would. So I wish I could tell you that this is what a sex offender looks like or seems like. Some other factors that we do know about, particularly interfamilial sex offenders, is that they tend to have poorer social skills than non-sexual offenders. They report feelings of powerlessness, low self-esteem. They tend to have some attachment issues and adult strained relationships or difficult relationships with adults. They tend to just relate a little bit better with children. And some of these are somewhat similar across intra and extra-familial sexual offenders. Thank you.
I just want to add a nursing perspective that when we talk about all these things that happen to people, there's something called the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Events. All these horrible psychological traumas do create physical illness in people. We now have the research to demonstrate that, and it can be any type of illness, not just mental illness. People get asthma, they get cancer, they get things that you might not connect with emotional trauma. But that's why, speaking to Lynn's point, the sooner we get people treatment, the better off they're going to be.
Yep. Thank you. The second question, Corey, I have for you. Could you explore a little bit, you touched on it, maybe a little bit about typology, treatment options as we were touching on, and maybe what works and what doesn't work with regard to these perpetrators? Certainly. Well, we've taken a lot of criminal justice approaches to managing sex offenders, and a lot of the research has suggested that that has been money not well spent. So tracking sex offenders, the sex offender registry, they're all kind of fraught with problems, and they're not addressing the fact that most of our sexual offenders it's happening within the home. There was funding to create sex offender registries, but not a lot of funding to follow through. We're certainly not funding treatment options particularly well for sexual offenders. There's not a lot of options, particularly if you're a juvenile offender. But there are some things that work, and I think that's another myth, that treatment doesn't work for sexual offending. It can.
It just has to be responsive to the needs of the offender. It can't be a blanket approach. So what tends to work, depending on the needs of the offender, are things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So addressing some of the negative or problematic cognitions that might come along with sex offending. For example, some like, well, the child said that they said I could do it because they didn't say no, or I'm just helping the child learn how to have sex, or it's not gentle, it's sex, it's not abuse, it's just sex. So addressing some of those problematic thoughts. Cognitive behavioral therapy has also been shown to be very effective when combined with anti-androgen blockers or anti-androgens and antidepressants. So lowering the overall sex drive, lowering the numbers of erections that a male sex offender would have, or a person who has a penis but not identify as male. So those tend to work somewhat. The strongest support we have for treatment are those that are following the R&R, risk needs responsivity model. They're strengths-based approaches, which I think plays into the problem with funding and what we want to fund. People don't want to fund a strengths-based approach to offenders because they don't want to think of offenders as having strengths. But they do, and the idea is that we identify the level of risk, we identify the needs that the offender has, the criminogenic needs, like what's going to cause them to reoffend, so things like substance abuse or poverty or things like that, and then that we're responsive to their needs. And so it's not putting a low-risk offender in a high-risk category. That can actually cause them to be more likely to reoffend than if we didn't treat them at all. So it's better usage of our limited resources, but there are some treatments, like I said, that have been found to be somewhat effective with some sexual offenders. Thank you very much.
And I know it's not popular, but unfortunately most perpetrators were victims, and it's important to remember that when we talk about treating them.
Mm-hmm. And not just sexual offenders, I think there is some research to suggest that sex offending either has a genetic component or a familial component, however way you want to look at that. But it's all victims, not all victims, but victims of all types of abuse are more likely to engage in sexual offending than not just folks who were sexually offended against.
And those victims who are sexually abused and experience more violence as victims are more likely to become perpetrators themselves. Because if you look at the research, there's a huge span of what percentage of children who were sexually abused as kids become offenders themselves. But you have to look at the quality of that abuse. And when they feel like it's been done against their will, when there's been more violence, they're more likely to become offenders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for all of these insightful and dark topics. So we have just 6 minutes left. I think I'd like to open it up to questions either from the audience or questions from our virtual audience. The two topics that I wanted to learn a little bit more about were children, specific offense and traumas against children, and also the intersection of that offense with technology. But I'd love to hear from people in the audience, either here or virtual. Questions for our experts? Well, then I will ask my question. I have a lot of questions. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, we heard a little bit at the beginning, really overlaying the topic of sexual offense, of traumatic bonding with technology, and I'm particularly thinking about the technology that is now in the hands of children in a way that it's never been before. Mm-hmm. So children are buying and getting cell phones younger and younger and younger. What are some intersections that you think might be relevant for our audience to consider?
One of the first things that comes to mind, I'm not sure this is quite what you're looking at, is just the gap between knowledge in what's out there. I learn a lot from my students in terms of what technology is out there, and so I think there's just a big gap, and parents or adults might not know what their kids are using. I guess that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind is that there is a lot out there that can be accessed by children and folks who are savvy enough to use it.
And many kids encounter pornography by accident. For instance, this site has been closed down, but a fourth grader who's trying to do research for a social studies project might want to go on and find out about the White House. The White House site is whitehouse.gov, but for a while there was this site, whitehouse.com, that was a pornographic site. So 9, 10-year-olds could be doing their homework, and the parents are thinking that they're doing their homework, and they go a whole different place.
I did have that happen once. Now, granted, I was studying forensics, so you could understand the crossover, but it really was shocking because I wasn't looking for pornography. So when it came up, it was like, oh.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the whole technology is really scary because, perpetrators know how to use this, and they target kids. And they know what sites your kids go on, and they're there looking for them. I mean, I really don't want to make people more frightened, but unfortunately, this is true.
And it's an opportunity, I think, we don't see, again, you want to talk about mythology, myths and typologies, this idea that, again, folks are kind of pulling your kids into the bushes and molesting them is it can happen, but the chance of it happening is relatively small. It's more likely to have happened after a child's developed a relationship with someone over time. The internet is another way to develop relationships with persons and be groomed and be prepared and build this trust and rapport. Hey, why don't we finally meet? And there's, the idea of catfishing and folks present, oh yeah, I'm 17 too, and they're actually 37 or not 17. So there's a lot of opportunity for additional grooming, I think, through the internet, and access to pornography is another element of that. And it also plays into reinforcing deviant sexual behaviors amongst offenders, as it's easily accessible. So it's almost harder to avoid than it is to find.
True.
So the what's the word I'm trying to say? It's there for the taking, I guess, and that can reinforce what you're trying to not engage in. So it's for both the offense and the victim side. Makes things a lot more difficult and complex.
So we see maybe a different, where in Toy Breakers we see one kind of voyeurism, sexualized voyeurism. Here, maybe through the internet or through technology, we see a different aspect or a different avenue for voyeurism or grooming relationships that you were talking about, Corey. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maybe time for one question? Has anyone thought about? Just wait for the mic, one sec.
Okay, thank you. When you were talking about trauma bonding and how most sexual offenders are within the family, what would be some ways to teach young children to distinguish between their bonding that is already present within their family and establishing boundaries and knowing what is appropriate and not?
That's a great question. Do you want to talk from the child side?
From the child side, we haven't done too well, okay? That we've gone through periods where we've tried to teach kids about good touch, bad touch, but it has not been very successful because it might be easier to do with a stranger, but when it's someone the child loves, or someone who's saying to the child, come with me and we'll do this and then we'll go for ice cream. It's a lot harder for kids to make that distinction. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it becomes such a worm's nest, and it's not like suddenly something bad happened. Like if you were to open your door and your neighbor hit you in the face, you would know that was wrong, mm-hmm. right? But it's intertwined with so much often love and caring, but then that love becomes confused. What is love? Mm-hmm. So it's very hard, and that's where we need to, I think, work with kids very, very early in life. Just to give an example, I worked with a 4-year-old boy, And you can kind of figure this one out, but he used to do this play where he would take two dinosaur puppets, and one would be Daddy Dinosaur and one would be Baby Dinosaur, and Daddy Dinosaur would pound Baby Dinosaur into the floor and then tuck him in with a blanket and say, Daddy loves you. And it just kind of illustrates just that confusion and that conflict. And even though this father had terribly hurt this child still very much wanted to believe that his father loved him.
All I have to add to that is that, trying to reduce other risk factors, early identification and intervention is key. I think as we're ending, it's important to leave on a positive note that if a child does experience some of these abuses, it doesn't mean that they're going to be some unfunctional adult or that they're not going to be able to be resilient. But the earlier we can intervene with the families, the more we can talk about these types of topics so that folks know and know what to look for. Believing children when they say something's up is hugely important. We can't prevent all things from happening, but we can certainly, I think, reduce the harm and try and support families in having healthier boundaries and just more options, I think, for folks. But in terms of complete prevention, that, as Dr. Kellner outlined, would be extraordinarily difficult, especially given developmental limitations of children and how and what they understand.
Thank you. I think we have one question from our virtual chat.
Yes, we do. This one's for Lynn Kellner. What actually constitutes a corrective experience for child victims?
Oh, that's a great question. One that embodies a sense of respect for the child, a sense of they are valued as a person, both physically, emotionally, any other way you can think of, and not being put in positions where they're asked to do things that are beyond their developmental level, or where it's a tit-for-tat type thing of, I will give you this treat if you do this for me, meaning something that's inappropriate.
I think we have reached the end of our panel. I want to thank again our three panelists very much. And from the same grant through the library has sponsored a book for each of you by our keynote, who will be here to sign and present at 2:30. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your insights. I still have goosebumps from some of your comments, but it was very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have to say, if anybody needs help, call Jane Doe Incorporated or Pathways for Change. There are local organizations if you do need help or know anyone who needs help.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Our next panel, as you can tell, is another student-led panel, and this is entitled Exploring the Physical and Digital Archives with the Chocolate War. In this panel, young adult literature students will share their experiences reading and analyzing the Chocolate War. Then they'll speak to the rich points of the text and how they explored those rich points in the archives, reflecting on how interacting with artifacts in the archives deepened and challenged their understanding of the novel. And then they might share some ways for using this text with middle and high school students. As with other panels, we'll have a Q&A to follow at the end, so please hold your questions until then. And again, questions are welcomed both from people in our physical audience as well as people in our virtual audience. Now let's give our attention to our student panelists. My young adult literature students, please join me in welcoming Sarah Desiderio, Paul Karaoke. Do you want to wave a little bit so they know where you are, sir? Sarah Desiderio, Paul Karaoke, Bridget McHugh, Kelly Mansfield, Peter Morales-Gomez, Lauren Saunders, Nicole Snow, Courtney Soares, and Maggie Wolfel.
So while reading this, I had a lot of questions as to why he wanted to write it and what made him want to write it. And during the archives, we went back and we were looking, and we were surprised that we actually found a quote from him to, I think it was someone that, like a student that had wrote a letter to him, and his quote was about his son and how his school was selling chocolates, and how his son said that he did not want to sell the chocolates.
He's right there. Yeah.
And as to, he wrote the book out of his fears of what would happen to his son if he didn't sell the chocolates. And it made me really think, what if his son didn't sell the chocolates? What if this was real? It made me question a lot. And another thing we found was the map of Goober's Run in the book and how it was around here, and it just made us put the book into real life. The map of maybe his son was running, and the map of why he did not do, why he wrote the book out of the fears. What if it really did happen to his son? We didn't really know why.
So the basis of our research was deciding what is real and what is not. So we took a few main ideas of the map and the school, and then so when we went to the archives, they had brought out about 4 boxes of all papers regarding his writings, students' writings, magazines, newspapers, and we found we had a question, and we were like, oh, do you know where we could find this? Which box would it be in? And they're like, oh, it's in the back. So we went back, and there's this huge room with these huge bookshelves, and there are just bookshelves and bookshelves and cases of all of Robert Cormier's everything. Typewriters, more papers, his books, signed copies, everything you could find. And in one of those boxes, we found a student-written essay, an essay a student wrote. And one of the quotes from that says, "The setting of the chocolate war is ridiculous. How many schools have an intricate team of bullies like the Vigils? Left and right, all we see is twisted view of high school. The entire novel plays out like some exaggerated sermon preached by the devil himself. There is no justice, no hope, and no salvation." So I thought that was very ironic, seeing as how it is based on a real high school, on a team of bullies, on a Catholic school. So I thought it was very ironic that was brought up, and it's just amazing what you can find in these archives.
Okay, so our rich point that we came up with before going into the archives sort of focused on the reversal of roles with children and adults in the book. The students are sort of put into this position where they have to take the maturity role that the adults don't have in the book. And my specific question with that is I wondered how students now would relate to that, because when I read the book, it was very intense and far off from my experience in high school that it felt almost archaic. I thought it was accurate to that time period, but I didn't know how it would translate to students now if it was anything that was relatable. And I'd never been in the archives before, so I didn't really know what to expect. And something that I found was there was a professor for a grad class that had their students write an imaginary letter to Robert Cormier talking about what they liked in the book. And there was one student who said that they felt that Brother Leon was sort of acting like a child and the kids acted more like adults, so it kind of lined up perfectly with what we found in it. And that was just something that I thought was interesting as I'm going to be a teacher. I guess if I was to use it with students, I would maybe think about, when you're reading this, do you feel uncomfortable? Is this something you would do? Would you be in the position of the students? Would you stand up for yourself? Or would you, fall under the rules of the adults?
Yeah, so we had the same rich point talking about the roles of adults versus kids. And when I was in the archives, I found an interview with Robert Cormier, and I thought it was really interesting because it touched on how these years are supposed to be the best years of your lives. And when he was in high school, he felt like maybe he was doing something wrong because while he had ups and downs, there was a lot of downs. And it kind of talks about how parents lie to their kids almost when they say that. And it touches on the responsibility, and you're supposed to be somewhere at 11, but also someone tells you to be there. So it's kind of Brother Leon fighting with the kids. It just shows that maybe the parents aren't as responsible and maybe the kids are more responsible. And also the language he uses in the book kind of shows how he is very childlike and he's not always the adult role that he should be playing.
I was in the same group, and we did talk about the whole adult versus kids roles, so to say. And well, I have to be honest, like I wasn't that surprised, so to say, because well, half my life I grew up in Kenya, and the high school I went to high school there for about let's say like the equivalent of like a semester, and the stuff we went through there is not even close to this. I'm like while others are being shocked, I'm thinking like like this is like a normal day, right? In the high school that I was at. So going into the archives, I wasn't exactly sure, like it's so much information. We barely got to scratch the surface, but I was intrigued by the fact that like there was so much. I guess the behind the scenes. I aspire to be a filmmaker, so the behind the scenes did get to me the most. And Robert Cormier talks about how most of all he's like a storyteller, but he does have a sense of morality and responsibility when he creates a universe. And he talks about the high school, like the high school setting being a metaphor for the real world. And I kind of have to agree with that, in the sense that I get, what I mean, like telling this story is important, so kids are better equipped for the world. Like the nice guy doesn't always win. Even though parents do try to protect their kids, as far as like I guess the book was banned or something in a bunch of states. I get how like parents do protect their kids to, we always want to tell the happy story, so to say. Well, you do. I'm not a parent yet, but you know what I mean. Like you want to tell that story, that the happy ending. Like what I mean. Like it's all like I guess bread and butter, but it's not always that way. And Robert Cormier, in the interviews that I found, the articles that I found, that for the most part, that's what I guess intrigued me, if I would say. That was my experience at the archives.
Hi, my name's Courtney. My partner Peter here. We did a project focusing on the quote found in Jerry's poster on his locker that says, "Do I dare disturb the universe?" And at first, he doesn't even understand what this quote means. But as he goes throughout the book and he kind of rebels against the vigils and the mainstream of things, he starts to slowly understand that he's the man in the poster, kind of standing by himself, going against everyone else. And he learns what all the negative consequences are that come with it. I mean, at the end, he's left barely breathing. But I thought that this point was really important because, especially in young adult literature, because you have to push kids to learn how to challenge themselves and understand that there's going to be some pushback. But at the end of the day, you just have to figure out who you are, where you fit in society, and amongst those around you. So the archives kind of enriched that for me. As Maggie said, there was a lot of details we saw that we couldn't have discussed in class without knowing all this added background. So there was also a good sense of a collaborative effort. There was other groups, like people here, that would come up to Peter and I and give us papers and say, hey, I think this would be really good for the rich point that you're focusing on, and vice versa. And it was great because we just saw so many different perspectives and saw a lot of concepts and ideas that we hadn't even considered before. So.
Yeah, so my experience with the archives was kind of insightful, just to see how everyone kind of reacted to it. And it seemed like a younger audience kind of had more of like a kind of more crazier reaction, like how could this happen? Kind of they couldn't really accept that the protagonists kind of faced this fate. And for people that wrote essays, they kind of broke down the quote, or like the question, like, do I dare disturb the universe? And kind of going against the powers that be and standing up for something, because it kind of resonated with me, just kind of looking at what people do in history. And it seems that a lot of history, there's a lot of people that end up kind of standing for something and don't really kind of see that kind of their effort being justified. So a lot of it is kind of important for young adults to kind of take in and accept, especially as they're growing up, because they need to know that like life isn't kind of all jolly and like all the problems will be faced in the matter of a book. So it's just, I think it's nice to see that Cormier chose a very realistic approach to it. And I know he was dabbling on making a sequel, and a lot of people that were like writing to him kind of wanted that. But I feel like if he just left it at this, it'd be kind of more impactful for like young adults. So, yeah.
So, I was in a group with Nicole, and to be honest, we didn't even know the archives existed. It's our first semester here, now our second one. I'm a transfer student, Nicole's a freshman. So when our professor told us, oh, we're going digging through the archives, we're like, what? The what? And so we didn't know what topic we wanted to discuss. And we went down to the archives, and there were just boxes, and we were like, oh my, this is all in this one book? And Katie's like, yeah, but there's more. So if you don't find anything you like here, we got a whole back room. And I was like, oh, okay. So after doing some digging, we decided that we wanted to discuss and research why the book was banned. It was banned in some high schools and not others. Like, Nicole and I personally read this book in high school, but discussing with others in our class, they didn't. So we wanted to know why. So we started digging through articles, and we found critic reviews and letters handwritten from students, teachers, like anybody who had an opinion about the book, and we read through so much and tried to just pick out pieces that we could put together. These letters, some of them were dated before Nicole and I were even born, so we were like, wow, and they were still talking about relevant issues today. So that was one of the things that we liked about our issue. There was one letter talked about why there was so much bullying in the book, and that was dated like 84 or something. We were like, oh, well, we weren't born, and there's still bullying in our schools today. So we did our project, got all of our information. Like Courtney said, we had other groups coming up to us and handing us articles. We're like, look, this talks about like why this teacher won't teach it to this classroom. This talks about why a teacher did teach it to her classroom, and so on. And then all of a sudden, I don't remember who it was, but someone hands us the missing chapter and was like, look, this was in the original book, like, you need to read this. And we were like, what? Like, it's a missing chapter? So they're like, yeah. And after we read through it all, we got to see why the band was booked and everything.
So yeah, back to that missing chapter. Like that, I think, was one of, like, even though it wasn't like published in the book, it was like a big reason as to why, like, it was banned, I believe, because it was, the chapter was consisted of some pretty graphic masturbation. And so that, obviously that was a really heavy underlying theme of the Chocolate War. There was a lot of sexual references. There was a lot of use of profanity. There was like instances of bribery, distortion, a lot of physical violence. Many people thought it was inappropriate for the targeted age range, despite there being not a targeted age range. And it had a really pessimistic view on life that teachers were not a fan of, and we're like, we're not teaching this to our high schoolers. But it was really interesting to see this caveated by the letters that the students were writing to Robert Cormier, because they were like, oh my gosh, I really loved like this book. Like, it was, like, there was so much that they enjoyed about it, and yet it was banned in a lot of high schools because of all the terrible themes that were presented throughout it. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for exploring the rich points that you originated upon reading The Chocolate War and sort of offering a bit about your experience in the archive. Because we have heard from all of our panelists and we're trying to keep to time, I wonder if anyone in the audience has any questions for our students. Any questions about the assignment? Any questions about the experiences in the archives? I still remain, even though I know that, even though I've heard them express these, I didn't know that we had an archive. It still surprises me to hear it, even though it's not the first time that I've heard it. You know, it's been such an important part of my life and my work since coming to the university. I'm happy that I got to share it with them, and I hope that the experience was enriching. Any questions virtually or in person?
I just have a question.
All right.
So I get to bring students to the archive for kind of a different reason. And I was always kind of curious about bringing students here, because I don't teach young adult literature, so I don't get the opportunity to bring them specifically for the Cormier bit. But I wondered, what did you bring back when you left the archive and you continued reading the book and you continued thinking about the book? Like, how did you see it differently after seeing all these primary texts?
Personally, I just, like I said, I was, I guess, the behind the scenes for the most part. Like, I was very, interested to see the process of how he got to the actual, published book and whatnot. Seeing, like you mentioned, the chapter that was completely taken off, like that to me is what, made me realize, okay, hey, I guess at the time, you also have to, I guess, involve or rather think about the time that the book was set up, and it's groundbreaking stuff at that point, I would consider it. So to me, what I brought back would just be just the process. It's how he talks in the interviews too. I did take a whole lot of pictures of the interviews and whatnot, and seeing how Robert Cormier was very interested in truth telling, so to say. You know what I mean? The interviews that he had, just things that he would say. I guess telling the truth, no matter what. As a storyteller, getting to see how he can, put something out like that, knowing the backlash that could come. I guess I don't know if I answered the question, but the behind the scenes for the most part. That's what I took away with.
So we finished the book before we went into the archives, and I went back after finding everything we found, and I reread it, and I kind of pictured I was his son reading it and saying, oh wow, what if this did happen to me? And it made me put it into real life and finding the map. It made me put it into real life, that I could walk around Fitchburg and I could go for the run he went around, and I could go to the school and I could see all that stuff. And we figured out that when he sat down to write this, he might have not expected it to turn out as how he wrote it. He might have thought it was going to turn out completely different. And so going into the archive, I didn't expect to find out that it was actually about a real life. We thought it was just going to be he just sat and wrote it. And as I found out that it was actually about his son, and if he didn't sell those chocolates and the backlash he would have got, it made me think wow, maybe this could have really happened. And it just kind of put a lot of it into perspective.
Any other reflections upon using or interacting with the archives?
There's another question from Texas here.
Question from Texas.
So, yeah. So this audience member asks regarding the banning of the book, whether or not you thought that there were reasons, or particularly around cultural norms, of why it might have been banned in some places versus others.
I think that's definitely a possibility, just because the events of the chocolate war did happen at a Catholic school, and I don't want to pull in any politics here, but I would say that some states or residents of a lot of states might have more religious beliefs than others, so they might have considered that it was like blasphemy or something. They could never present it to their students, much less since it was such corruption and distortion at a Catholic school, and then having kids at another Catholic school read that book, that's insane. It's that could never happen. So I think that's definitely a possibility.
Any other questions or thoughts? Well, then I would like to close the panel and thank the students again. All presenters will be given copies of our keynotes book through a grant from the library, so thank you to the library yet again, and thank you to these students for presenting on their experience using the archives.
In this 25-minute panel, we'll hear from Laura Baker, professor of history, whose research examines contemporary social issues in historical perspective and from the perspective of local and regional communities. Anna Marie Consalvo, associate professor of education with research on youth voice in the teaching of writing and multimodal writing practices. She'll be joining us from afar. Catherine Covina, assistant professor of English studies, who has published and presented extensively on literacy praxis, entwining theory and practice to support English teachers at all levels in their classrooms. And finally, Asher Jackson, the university archivist. A 5-minute Q&A will follow. Please hold your questions until that time. Those joining us virtually may send questions through the chat feature, if you would send it to everyone, at any time, and those will be posed during the Q&A. Virtual participants, please take a moment to mute your microphones, while those physically present do the same with their mobile devices.
All right, so I am Laura Baker, and I teach in the history department, and I also teach in our educator preparation program. And my background is interdisciplinary. I have a PhD in a field called American Studies, which is an integrative field, and my own interests are in integrating culture and history. So I share that because that informs how I have approached incorporating the Cormier archive material into my work and into my teaching. So I've done a few things over the years now with Cormier. I started out doing After the First Death and was able to make use of the censorship archive, the exhibit. So associated with all of this are these wonderful digital exhibits on Cormier, and I was able to draw on the exhibit on censorship, since this is one of his texts that was subject to some censorship. I was able to bring students into the archive to look at the documents surrounding that. More recently, thanks to some time to work during my sabbatical on some major projects, I've started using short stories from his collection 8+1. And these short stories, Cormier explicitly identifies as autobiographical. It was fun to see him do that in the archives, for actually hold the object, but it's also part of how he introduces the stories in the published collection. And they're also, for the Cormier fans, they're not as edgy as his usual work. He also acknowledges that they're a bit more sentimental, largely because they're recalling his early childhood, early adolescence, I would say, sort of middle school age, growing up in Leominster. And I'm sure, as many of you know, his novels are often, are very much about place. And so he writes about what he knows, and it's often easy to recognize Leominster and other aspects of North Central Mass in his work. So I wanted to use these short stories as a way to integrate history, as a way to integrate into the study of Fitchburg history different types of sources that would allow my students to experience, and not just research the past through conventional historical sources, but also through literature, which, especially in the case of autobiography, can offer a really compelling way into the past. So I created 2 assignments around these stories, one in a course on immigration called Immigration and American Identity, and I have a module in there where we look at oral histories also held in our university archive from the Fitchburg area. We read Cormier short stories, a couple of Cormier short stories from this collection. I have some other Fitchburg history-specific resources as well. And students loved being able to see the text, the literary text, in historical context. So use the literature for insight into the historical place we were studying, Fitchburg. but also be able to draw on what they were learning about Fitchburg history, and specifically Fitchburg immigration history, to understand the stories better. Specifically, we were reading these as stories of a second-generation immigrant. Cormier's family is French-Canadian, and especially, so we read President Cleveland, Where Are You? And Protestants Cry Too. That's a fun one. As a way of thinking about the experiences of the children of immigrants and what that's like. I also used those stories and an additional story in a graduate course for teachers. And this was an assignment that asked them to create a unit, a humanities unit, where they very consciously were to collaborate across English and history with an English educator, history educator, to collaborate and create a humanities unit that combined English language arts and history, social studies, learning outcomes. And in that case, I also included the story, My First Negro, which is in this collection, as a way, again, as an opportunity to use literature, because they almost read like historical fiction, to use literature as a way to study the past and to use the past to understand, and appreciate literary works in greater depth. But with My First Negro, it also gave us an opportunity to explore troublesome language in the archive, the historical archive, and in the literary archive. So in that story, Cormier uses the N-word. And it's a story, in terms of age development and developmental appropriateness, it'd be great for middle schoolers. But this is an age where maturity varies a lot. So we were able to have some very interesting conversations around how to teach a story like this that contains language that still has a lot of power to provoke us today, right? They're only problems because the issues are still there. And that's a course that I also was able to bring into the archive and have Asher speak to some of that as well, because the N-word, along with other language as well, is all over the archive. If you stick it into the library catalog, you'll pull up numerous entries. All right, 5 minutes. Did I do it?
Well done. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it might be my turn. So I'm going to go for it here. So I spent some time working with teachers in a professional development setting, finding inspiration from the Cormier collection from writing from primary documents. And at this point, I'm going to share my screen with you to show you the slides that I created for this. Of course, the first thing I do is just introduce Robert Cormier and make sure that people understand that they probably know him, and that all of these different books are represented in the archive. And then, of course, like, how did I meet Robert Cormier, basically, and how did I end up kind of falling in love with his work? And it's been a long road from the early 90s to where I am now. And so as a teacher of writing and somebody interested very much in a research way in the teaching of writing, I was wanting to explore ways that the Cormier Archive could help teachers of writing help their students. So how do we engage in direct virtual conversations with an author? How do we use drafts as models and scaffolds to students on writing? How can we engage in inquiry projects, which are nonfiction, often are collaborative and interdisciplinary, as Dr. Baker was talking about, or even something like fan fiction? How can we use Cormier's work for this? So I invited the teachers at this National Writing Project special program in New Hampshire to do these very things, to have conversations with the author, to use his marked up manuscripts to model revision, to for inquiry project starters, fiction possibilities, and other kinds of things. I'm going to take you to a couple, given that we have a very short amount of time. But what I did was I would pre-select some of his letters around censorship. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So I gave them the link to this first exhibit's room on censorship battles that has letters in it. Then the instructions were, in your notebook, write back to him. What are your points of agreement and disagreement? And so this is the page that it takes, that it took the teachers or you to if you decide to go there. And here's one letter. And then up on the right, you can see other kinds of sub-exhibits, sort of loops within this very room that has other kinds of letters. But we can see that in this letter, you know, that this protection of children as a perpetual parental ideal is an improbable task. So I did want to share with you one of the participants' works regarding writing back to Robert. She ended up writing as a teacher, which was easy because she is a teacher. And so she writes, "Dear Robert, thank you so much for your letter," as if he had written to her. "I was especially struck by your line about deadly censorship, the kind that begins with the writer putting down words on the paper. I know that feeling, that sense that words are dangerous, that displeasing those in power will harm me, that I cannot risk it. Teachers, too, feel that deadly kind of censorship in relation to what they teach. It is not so much that the books are challenged publicly, but they're never taught, because the teacher censors his or her own choices before making them. You are correct to feel this is much more insidious than any outright censorship we do to ourselves." And probably many of you know he wrote a lot about censorship. And then, so another thing that we spent quite a bit of time was using his marked up manuscripts to model revision. The idea of revision is often pretty foreign to most, certainly undergraduate students, high school students, and even some master's students. So showing how a published author who writes really well goes through multiple drafts, I think is really powerful. So in this instruction, they were to go to this page, and I'll take you there in a second, with a marked up draft of a chapter of We All Fall Down. Read the draft, then find one paragraph and decide your final version in your notebook, and revise at least 2 of his marked up sentences. So basically asking them to step into Robert Cormier's shoes and see if they can't even mimic his style, but still calling on their own sense of authorship. This is an approach that's used in studio art all the time, where young artists are expected to replicate the work of the old masters. So this is what they would navigate to, and then they would read through some of this work and settle on a paragraph, okay? So in this, the Avenger, who's a key figure in We All Fall Down, is at the mall. He's patrolling the mall in search of particular individuals. And Jane, who he's enamored of, shows up. So it's hard to see this person's writing, but I do want to share this particular revision with you. The teenagers were all around, moving, always on the go, everywhere, both alone and in groups. They would laugh and call to each other, sometimes pushing and shoving. Guys flirting with the girls, and the girls flirting back with secret smiles and sidelong glances, eating hot dogs, pizza, and big greasy sandwiches, leaving streaks of ketchup and mustard on their cheeks. They wouldn't even put their napkins into the trash cans half the time, leaving them in greasy piles on the tables and floor. His blood boiled whenever he saw their careless mess. He hated slobs. He remembered hearing his father shrieking at his mother to clean up this damn mess after she would make dinner in the kitchen, the sink piled high with dishes, splattered tomato sauce across the stovetop. Better to keep things neat and tidy, like Jane. Jane was always so put together, her trim ponytail swaying, not a wisp of hair out of place. So that concludes my, my student work sharing, but I did the same thing for inquiry projects and gave them some possible entryways like evil or goodness, sort of thematically linked, and some kinds of big question things that could lead to them doing deep dives into real world events. And also possible fan fiction alternatives, writing an alternative ending or an alternative beginning. And like, Tolkien did that too with his prehistory of the world of The Hobbit. Or even a critical rewriting of underexplored or underrepresented characters, which is very possible given the time frame that Cormier was writing from. And of course, an episodic narrative loop. And so I suggest here Tunes for Bears to Dance to, and give them a link to take them to a particular document. And I did a little fishing, and I did find that fanfiction.org did have a small Cormier, a couple of pieces that I was able to find. I didn't open them up, but you can see that one has almost 6,000 words, and one has about 1,000. So you can open up this fan fiction as well, which is kind of a system of peers helping each other write better. But in any case, I feel like this is important work. Historians use primary documents all the time. Why don't we, and I mean we, meaning sort of people who are rooted more in studies of English or language arts, and why don't we go back to earlier drafts, both as for students as writers and as well as readers? So I just think there are so many possibilities here with using work like Robert Cormier's in teaching. Stop share.
So I will speak just briefly, and you already got to see 2 panels of my students, so I don't need to spend a lot of time outlining the projects that they did. I think I'll just start by saying that the Cormier Archives are such a magnificent resource, like such a jewel of our university, and I'm always thrilled anytime I get to use them myself and anytime I get to introduce students to them. I am always surprised when students don't know that we have the archives. I mean, not just the Cormier Archives in this case, but the archives. So it was fun, it was thrilling. I mean, I joked on my social media that we were, singing along to Indiana Jones theme, like exploring these, undiscovered treasures. So I'm so happy that I get to use them, happy that I get to introduce students to them. Teaching the young adult literature class, the parallel is very exact. It's very easy to understand teaching the Chocolate War and using the Chocolate War and exploring the Chocolate War archives with young adult literature. But you don't have to teach a young adult literature class to engage with Cormier's work. So when I teach Writing 1 or Honors English 1 and we use the John Fitch IV articles, I'm teaching argumentation and rhetoric. I'm teaching the skills of writers. What I ask the students to do is to read and annotate carefully, to analyze each of the pieces, to find themes that run through each of the pieces, to create a synthesized thesis statement and topical paragraphs. So I'm teaching them argumentation, but I'm using as the meat of the argument Cormier's work, which I think is, you don't have to teach young adult literature to teach and to use Cormier. So those are 2 ways that I use the archives with students, and I'm happy that many of you got to see the students present. The archives have fed me and fed us in our own work and scholarship. And I want to give another shout out to the annotated version of the Chocolate War. We're so happy and grateful that the Cormier family supported us in our work doing that. And we're continuing to try to put these chapters that we've created out there. We continue to have talks with our agent about moving this forward, especially with the anniversary coming up of the Chocolate War. My students loved using the annotated version. They were excited that on our university campus, we have things that no other university has. They were excited to come across them. They enriched the reading. So I'm thrilled that I got to do that, whether or not it gets published. It was exciting to do. It's good work, and I really enjoyed it. One of the first questions that we had was, is this going into local middle and high schools? Or is there any chance of collaboration? And I wanted to answer then, but I will answer now. I'm working with Anna and a student who we both taught, Natalie Chase, who is now, we both trained her to be a teacher. Now she's a teacher working at Monty Tech. The three of us are co-authoring a chapter where we're using Lord of the Flies, the Chocolate War, and the cultural discourse around toxic masculinity to understand each of those texts in a new way. So over our spring break, I'll be going into those classrooms and collecting artifacts that those students will be producing. So yes, it is alive and thriving in local high schools and middle schools, and there's great chances for integration and community collaboration between the university and between local high schools.
So I'm Asher. Oh, there we go. I'm Asher Jackson. I am the university's archivist here, and I have had the distinct pleasure of getting to work with everyone that you saw today, and it has been a genuine pleasure. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what my role is and kind of what my relationship to the Cormier collection in particular has been. Archivists who work in academic institutions, really their job is to kind of collect and organize and preserve material that may be of value to scholars and students, and that's the boring answer. It is important, but it is not as important as what I do with faculty and students. So I really see my role as less of an organizer and more of an instigator, and I think that is where interesting, unique scholarship comes from. My role as an archivist then in terms of instigating, right, and inspiring people to do primary resource research is to really find a way to present pathways for students and scholars that they may not be aware of, right? It's about learning about the things that you don't already know. And so one of the things that I really loved about the Cormier collection when I saw it, first of all, I freaked out completely because Chocolate War was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. So, and I couldn't believe that it was here. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a terrific job, right? And it was. But just kind of expanding it into a digital archive was really important to me because I wanted people across the country and hopefully across the globe to really see what was available and what was unique and significant about Cormier's work. I also, from a personal standpoint, had a very odd, I am not from Massachusetts, I'm actually from suburban Minneapolis. If any of you know Bloomington, Minnesota, that's actually where the giant mall is. That is where I am from. So very, very different existence but also I think when I was growing up, there's a familiarity here. The community here is very familiar to me in a way that definitely parallels where I was raised. And so for me to be able to take this feeling of familiarity and kind of see that Cormier was using his work, I had a very similar experience to the student who was talking earlier when I realized the Chocolate War was here. It's this place. It's not just a story. It's this place. It's the people in this place. It's the community that's reflected in that story. And so that sense of familiarity and that sense of recognition, I began to understand about myself. that didn't happen until I came here, and I understood why I identified with the story so closely, but also why I identified with this community so closely, even though I'm not from here. So the archive really had a way of revealing all of that to me, and I wanted to reveal that to students and faculty as well. And I got to do that, as you've seen today. We have a historian, we have education professors, we have English professors, we have journalist, Wafa, I'm coming for you next. She already works in the archive, but I think Cormier's work as a reporter is also really significant, and that's something that I think should be kind of brought to light as well. So I said all that to say this. There's a parallel between the challenges that Cormier presents in his works and the things that I hear when people come to use the archive, right? And there's also a parallel between the challenges that Cormier presents in his work and the things that people said to him when they wrote to him. And those things are things like why do we have to discuss this? Why do we have to know this about ourselves? Why can we not hide as we discussed with Laura Baker's grad class, why can't we just ignore or hide the ugly parts of our own history, right? Why do those have to be reflected in the historical record? Why do we have to study this? I don't like it. I don't understand it. And so one of the things that I really wanted to, and I'm excited I got to do, is really work on those challenges and those statements of challenge and say, you know, here's what Cormier was up to. Here's what he had to say about this in his own words. Here's what this community was doing, and here's why this happened the way that it happens. And here are things we should continue to address. These are problems that have been problems for a long time, and people have been struggling with these things for a long time. But here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. Here's how we need to adjust our expectations, and here's ways we need to present new challenges to what exists or what we know exists. And so I'm sorry, this is sounding very abstract. I apologize. But one of the things that I really like is getting faculty and students to really answer those questions for themselves and to help students answer those questions for themselves. If they don't like something, if they feel challenged by something or uncomfortable by something, why is that? And what kind of a relationship can they have with an author who is no longer alive, right? And the answer is you can have a fairly close, fairly intimate relationship, provided that the records have been kept, provided that we cherish the narrative that's been given to us, right? And so that was a lot. I'm going to stop there, and we'll take time for questions.
Okay, we are running a smidge behind, but we do have time for a question or two. If there are any questions from the audience.
We're the Anna Consalvo fan club, Karen and I. So hi, Karen. Hi, Anna. Karen thought
Hi,
you were
Sam.
going to be here in person.
Hi, Karen.
Came to give you a hug, but this is a little long distance.
I just want to comment on, this is amazing. I've been coming to them since you started. I've kind of gone through this with you because she stays with me when she is here. And it's just an amazing thing you've done. And I reiterated what Chris said to the youngsters. Sorry, they're all children to me. Those nice young people that are going to college here, that Robert Cormier would have loved to be here. He definitely would have engaged and would have asked a lot of questions. And so it's a beautiful tribute to him and to his family. Thank you all that have done it.
Well, I have one question. I have 10 questions, but I'll just ask one question. I have a question for you, Laura. How was it using literary text as a primary text in historical study?
May I ask why you're asking that?
As someone who spent so much time studying literature and not as much time studying history, I guess my assumption was that it would be of less interest to a historian as a historical document to consider fictional texts or fictional renditions of history.
So I'm thinking about my answer because to me it's so obviously an appealing historical source. And some of that might be my interdisciplinarity, but as I've listened to, everybody speak here, so Anna Mary's, your own work, I'm looking at you going, you sound like a historian. So a lot of, I seek to do authentic work, and literature is an essential way in which we understand our humanity and our human experience. And it seems so very obviously then an appealing historical source. So that's why I had to ask you, like, where are you coming at this from? Like, does this seem odd to you? And if that's the case, that's unfortunate. Obviously, works of fiction cannot be treated the same as a property record, for example, a marriage certificate. They're two different sources, but one of the things that I'm always, as a historian, I'm always trying to teach my students is to source. Know the attributes of the source you're working with and take those into account. But yeah, it comes very, very easy. What would you rather read, a history book or a novel? It's true of most of us.
There were no further questions. I just wanted to say thank you to Anna from Beyond. I was always very curious about the Writers Project and the work that you've done, so I really appreciated seeing what the attendees had done with the exhibits. So thank you. We'll have a brief pause for people to grab food before our keynote, a very brief pause.